"You're coming with me," said the lonely rancher to the woman beaten for giving birth to triplet girls, Wyoming Territory, late January 1877. The high ridges of the Snowhorn Mountains were blanketed in snow, and the wind howled like a wounded beast. The first sound that caught Silas Grers' ear wasn't the wind. It was the sharp, high-pitched wail of something smaller, more fragile. He pulled his horse to a stop, the snow crunching beneath the hooves, and tilted his head toward the timberline. And there it was again, a baby's cry. No, multiple cries. He narrowed his eyes and dismounted. The path hadn't been ridden in days, cutting through the trees like a scar. His boots sank deeply into the snow with each step. He led his horse by the reins, listening intently, his breath visible in the cold air. The cries grew louder as he approached a clearing near an old fence post, half-rotted and half-buried in snow. And there she was, a woman barely standing, tied cruelly to the post with barbed wire, her arms bound behind her, skin torn, wrists bleeding, snow clinging to her lashes, and the edges of her hair frozen stiff. Her lips were cracked, her face pale as death, save for the bruises blooming violet across her cheekbones. At her feet, 3 bundles, infants no older than a day. One whimpered weakly. The other 2 lay silent, wrapped in what looked like the shredded remnants of a nightgown. The woman's head shifted slightly. She was conscious, barely. "Don't let them take my daughters," she whispered. Silas dropped to one knee beside her without hesitation. He pulled off his gloves and checked each of the babies. Shallow but steady breaths, cold skin so cold it seemed to seep into the bones. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice low, steady, and certain. She blinked slowly, as though it took effort to register the words. He drew a knife from his boot and sliced the barbed wire. It had bitten deep into her forearms. Blood welled where the rusted steel tore free, but she didn't scream, she didn't even flinch. He wrapped his arms around her waist to steady her as her legs gave out. Her body was limp, heavy with exhaustion and blood loss. Silas didn't hesitate. He scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. Then the babies, one by one, he gathered them. He tucked the smallest against his coat, securing them with a thick wool blanket from his saddle. They barely stirred. The wind picked up, slicing across the open space. He shielded them with his body as best as he could. His horse nickered anxiously nearby. Silas glanced toward the horizon. They had half a mile back to his cabin uphill. Through the snow, he adjusted his grip on Marabel, tightened the wrap around the infants, and whispered, not for her, not for the babies. Maybe to the wind or maybe to God. You don't die here, not on my land. He mounted the horse carefully, keeping her in front of him, the babies tucked between them. She weighed next to nothing. The infants were lighter than winter rabbits. The cold had drained them all. Time wasn't their friend. The trail back was slow, the wind relentless, but Silas moved without pause. There was no time to ask who she was or what demons chased her, only enough time to keep her alive. The cabin was dark when they arrived. The fire had long since gone cold. Silas kicked open the door, carried her inside, and laid her gently on a bed of quilts near the hearth. The babies came next. He set them in a basket lined with rabbit pelts, then turned to stoke the fire with hands that didn't shake. Not yet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks that led to her place of pain. Inside, Silas worked by the firelight, silent and certain. A stranger had been left to die, but not here, not on his land. Silas moved with practiced silence. He hung his soaked coat by the fire and peeled off his gloves, revealing his calloused, cracked hands. Marabel lay unconscious on a bed of piled wool blankets in the corner. Her lips were blue, her hands loosely wrapped in strips of linen. She hadn't stirred since they arrived. The babies began to mew, low and weak, but alive. Silas filled an iron pot with goat's milk from a jug he had hidden behind stacked wood and placed it on the fire to warm. He found a small feeding spoon carved from pine and set it beside a tin bowl. Then he walked over to the woman. She was barely breathing. He dipped a cloth into a pail of warm water, wrung it out, and began cleaning the dried blood from her ankles and calves. The bruises went deep, mean purple-black swells along her shins. Someone had kicked her hard and often. Her knees were scraped raw. He worked gently, dipping the cloth, wiping, then covering her legs again with the edge of the blanket. She didn't wake. Her breathing was shallow but steady. When the milk warmed, he scooped some into the tin bowl and tested it on the back of his hand. It was still too hot, so he waited, watching the smallest baby, who had started to cry now, thin, urgent whimpers. He crouched beside the makeshift cradle and reached in. The infant's skin was warm again. That was a good sign. Silas used the spoon to feed tiny sips into the girl's mouth. She took it clumsily, then greedily. He did the same with the other two, pausing only to wipe their mouths and tuck the blankets closer around their heads. A faint sound drew his attention from the bed. The woman stirred, her eyelids fluttering like leaves in the wind. Her voice was cracked, barely audible. "My name's Marabel Quinn." Silas stood and crossed the room in 2 strides. He crouched beside her. "Silas," he said simply. Her lips moved again, but no sound followed. Her gaze slipped from him to the babies, who now rested quietly in the firelight. One of them sneezed, the smallest. Marabel's eyes flooded with tears, but she did not cry, not truly. They fell silently down cracked cheeks, her body too tired, too broken to sob. Silas rose and walked to the back of the room. From a trunk, he pulled out an old fur cloak, thick elk hide lined with rabbit fur. He folded it and brought it to the basket, carefully placing it beneath the sleeping children. It made the cradle warmer, softer. When he looked back, Marabel was watching. He didn't speak. He only gave her a slow nod and returned to the hearth to add more wood. Sparks rose like fireflies and vanished into the cabin's smoke-stained rafters. Time passed quietly. The only sounds were the pop of the fire, the slow wind outside, and the shifting breath of 4 bodies slowly returning from the edge of death. Later, as Silas fed the fire one last time before resting, he heard her voice again. This time, firmer, not stronger, but certain. "You didn't leave us." He did not reply. He only sat by the fire, staring into it as the snow howled against the walls and the cold beyond was held at bay. For now, the storm outside had softened to a hush. Snow still fell, but the wind had died, leaving behind a heavy stillness that wrapped around the cabin like a shroud. Inside, the fire glowed low and steady, casting flickers of gold across the rough timber walls. Marabel lay propped against folded blankets. Her face had regained some color, though the bruises still bloomed beneath her skin like ink stains. Her voice was hoarse, her throat raw from cold and crying, but she could speak now. Silas sat nearby, sharpening a blade against a wet stone with slow, careful strokes. He hadn't asked her anything, not who she was, not who had done this, not why she had been left to die. That silence, in its own way, was a kindness. "I was 17 when I married Joseph Quinn," Marabel said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear in the hush. "He was 34, rich, powerful. My father said I was lucky." Silas didn't look up. He kept sharpening the knife slowly, steadily. "I thought I was lucky too at first," she continued. "He brought me to a big house with tall windows and marble floors. I wore silk. I slept on feather pillows, but he never touched me like a husband should. Not kindly, not gently." She paused, glancing at the sleeping babies beside the fire. Their tiny chests rose and fell in perfect rhythm. "First daughter," she frowned. "Second, he stopped speaking to me. Third," her voice cracked. Silas finally looked up. His eyes were calm, steady, waiting. "When the 3rd girl was born, he called the midwife and said she cursed the womb. He told his brothers I was no better than a mule, useless if I could not give him a son. That night they beat me." She turned her face slightly, revealing a faint scar along her jawline. "Old, faded. I thought he might kill me, but instead he dragged me to the old fence post and tied me there. She said, if the snow did not take me, then I was meant to live. She called it justice. Her hands trembled as she spoke. One reached instinctively toward the basket holding her daughters. "They said girls are nothing but mouths to feed," she whispered. Silas set the blade down. He did not speak, not right away. His jaw flexed once tightly, then he stood and walked toward her. His boots made no sound on the cabin floor. He knelt beside her cot and reached for her hand. It was swollen and bruised, the knuckles scabbed, but he took it as if it were made of glass. Holding it gently in his large, weathered palm, he met her gaze. His voice was low and certain. "Here," he said, "your girls are the only thing worth feeding." Marabel's eyes filled with tears. This time, she did not hold them back. She let them fall silently down her cheeks, mixing with the warmth of the firelight and the sound of her daughter's breathing. Silas stayed kneeling beside her, hand in hers, his presence quiet and grounding. Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside that cabin, something had shifted. Not warmth exactly, something deeper, something that looked like the start of a promise. The days moved forward slowly, each one blending into the next like the steady flow of a river, quiet, unhurried, but relentless in its passage. Marabel's strength grew bit by bit. The bruises on her skin faded, and the weight of the past slowly started to lift from her shoulders, though it remained with her like a shadow. She had learned to walk without faltering, no longer afraid of the wind or the snapping of branches underfoot. In the cabin, the fire burned steady, the warmth a constant companion in the harsh cold. Silas never asked about her past. He worked in silence, maintaining the cabin, hunting in the woods, checking traps, and bringing in whatever he could find. When he was gone, Marabel tended to the babies, her hands moving with quiet precision as she cared for them. Her voice, once so weak, now filled the cabin with the soft lullabies she sang in the evenings. It was a rhythm they had found together, each learning the other's silence, each growing accustomed to the quiet companionship they had forged. One morning, after Silas had left for the woods, Marabel found herself standing at the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. It was as if she was seeing the world for the first time, no longer clouded by the fear and pain that had once consumed her. The snow was still falling, but it was no longer an enemy. Instead, it was part of the landscape, a peaceful blanket that wrapped the world in its white embrace. She smiled faintly, almost as if the world outside had forgiven her for the pain she had endured. Later that day, when Silas returned, he found her standing in the doorway, the wind tugging at her shawl. The babies were sleeping, nestled in their makeshift cradles by the fire. Marabel stepped outside to meet him, her eyes shining in the dim light of the late afternoon. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft but steady, "about what comes next." Silas stopped in his tracks, his eyes meeting hers. He had never asked her what she wanted for the future. It hadn't seemed important, survival had always been the focus. But now, in the stillness of the cabin, he saw something different in her eyes. Hope. A quiet promise that perhaps, despite everything they had been through, there was still something worth living for. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head slightly. "Maybe it's too soon, but I want to make a home here. I want this place to be more than just a shelter. I want it to be something we can share, something that's ours." Silas stood there for a moment, processing her words. Then he stepped forward, pulling her into his arms, as if to hold her against all the things that had tried to tear her apart. The warmth of the fire inside and the cold wind outside seemed to blend together in that moment, as if time itself had paused. "We'll build it," he said quietly, his voice resolute. "We'll build it together." That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Silas carved 3 small wooden plaques from cedar, each no longer than a handspan. He worked by the firelight, carving each letter with careful precision. Eloise, Ruth, June. Each name was etched into the wood, smooth and clean, the wood oiled so that it caught the flicker of the flames. He hung the plaques above the baby's resting place, each one a testament to the new life they had created together. Marabel watched him as he worked, her eyes following each stroke of the knife. She felt the weight of those names, heavy and beautiful, as if they were something she could hold onto. No one had ever carved her daughter's names into anything permanent. Not her father, not her husband. But Silas did it without hesitation, as though they were the most important names in the world. That night, when the girls were asleep, Marabel sat by the fire, her fingers brushing over the names on the plaques. A tear slipped down her cheek, but it was different this time. It wasn't from sorrow. It was from something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. As the night wore on, Silas sat beside her, his presence steady and comforting. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. The warmth between them was enough. They had found something in each other that had been lost long ago: trust, strength, and the quiet understanding that they were no longer alone. In the days that followed, they continued to rebuild the cabin. Silas worked on the walls, adding new beams and reinforcing the roof. Marabel helped where she could, gathering herbs and tending to the garden Silas had started. The simple tasks they shared became a rhythm, a way of life that began to feel almost normal. The babies grew stronger, their cries more vibrant, their movements more confident. Outside, the snow continued to melt, and the first signs of spring began to appear. Silas planted rows of vegetables in the garden, and Marabel spent hours tending to the plants, her fingers moving through the earth with a new sense of purpose. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was becoming a home, a place where they could live and grow, a place where the past could fade into the background and the future could be built. As the weeks passed, the girls grew fast. Eloise took her first steps, Ruth said her first word, fire. June sang before she spoke, her voice high and sweet, filling the cabin with sound. They laughed and played in the yard, their small feet kicking up the soft earth, their faces glowing in the sunlight. Silas watched them, his heart swelling with something he hadn't known he could feel. It was as if he had come alive again, not just for the work, not just for survival, but for something more: a family. A real family. One evening, after they had finished dinner, Marabel joined Silas on the porch. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, casting the world in gold. She handed him a mug of tea and sat beside him, her body close to his. They didn't speak right away, but there was a comfort in the silence, a feeling of connection that neither had expected. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world seemed at peace. The cabin, once a place of isolation, was now a place of warmth and love. And as the days stretched into summer, Silas and Marabel knew that the life they had built together was something neither of them had ever thought possible. But it was real, and it was theirs. Spring slowly crept in, bringing warmth and new breezes. Signs of life began to appear all around the cabin. Trees sprouted new buds, the earth was covered with a thick carpet of green grass, and wildflowers started blooming, brightening the quiet landscape of the mountains. The days grew longer, and the sunlight poured into the cabin more and more, filling the space with hope. Silas began expanding the garden, planting potatoes, carrots, squash, and beans, while Marabel took care of the surrounding herbs and plants. Every morning, she would wake before dawn, prepare breakfast for the family, check on the children, change their diapers, and feed them. Her movements were gentle and filled with care. The babies grew stronger with each passing day, their skin becoming rosier, their cries more vibrant. They were alive in a way that seemed to give her new strength. As the days passed, Silas would often be off hunting or checking traps, and when he returned, Marabel would be in the garden or with the babies. They worked together in the garden, planting new crops, picking herbs, or just enjoying the serenity of the land. It wasn't a busy life, but it was theirs, and it was enough. One afternoon, while Silas was outside, Marabel stood by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered world. It was as if she was seeing it all for the first time. The snow, which once represented a threat and an obstacle, now felt peaceful. The world outside was blanketed in white, but there was something different about it. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. It was just part of the landscape now, part of the world they were rebuilding. Later that day, Silas returned to find her standing at the door, the wind tugging at her shawl. The babies were sleeping soundly, nestled in their makeshift cradles near the fire. Marabel stepped out to meet him, her eyes sparkling in the dim light of the late afternoon. "I've been thinking," she said softly, her voice steady but her words full of something new, "about what comes next." Silas stopped in his tracks, his eyes meeting hers. He had never asked her what she wanted for the future. They had been surviving, just trying to get by, but now, as he looked at her, he saw something different in her eyes. There was hope there. A quiet promise that despite everything they had been through, there was something worth living for. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head slightly. "Maybe it's too soon, but I want to make a home here. I want this place to be more than just a shelter. I want it to be something we can share, something that's ours." Silas stood still for a moment, processing her words. Then he stepped forward, pulling her into his arms, as if to hold her against everything that had tried to tear her apart. The warmth of the fire inside and the cold wind outside seemed to blend together, creating a sense of unity, a sense of calm that they had both longed for. "We'll build it," he said quietly, his voice firm. "We'll build it together." That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Silas carved 3 small wooden plaques from cedar, each no longer than the span of his hand. He worked by the firelight, carving each letter with careful precision. Eloise, Ruth, June. Each name was etched into the wood, smooth and clean, the wood oiled so that it caught the flicker of the flames. He hung the plaques above the baby's resting place, each one a mark of the new life they were creating together. Marabel watched him as he worked, her eyes following each stroke of the knife. She felt the weight of those names, heavy and beautiful, as though they were something she could hold onto. No one had ever carved her daughter's names into anything permanent. Not her father, not her husband, but Silas did it without hesitation, as though they were the most important names in the world. That night, after the babies had fallen asleep, Marabel sat by the fire, her fingers brushing over the names on the plaques. A tear slipped down her cheek, but it wasn't from sorrow. It was from something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. As the night stretched on, Silas sat beside her, his presence steady and comforting. Neither of them spoke much, but there was an understanding between them. The warmth in the cabin wasn't just from the fire, it was from something more. They had found something in each other that had been lost for so long: trust, strength, and the quiet understanding that they were no longer alone. In the days that followed, they continued to rebuild the cabin. Silas worked on the walls, adding new beams and reinforcing the roof. Marabel helped where she could, gathering herbs, tending to the garden, and fixing small things around the cabin. The simple tasks they shared became their rhythm, and for the first time in a long while, life felt normal. The babies continued to grow, getting stronger each day. The cabin, once just a shelter, was becoming more than that. It was becoming home. As the weather warmed and the snow began to melt, Marabel and Silas watched their daughters grow. Eloise took her first steps, Ruth said her first word, fire. June sang before she spoke, her voice high and sweet, filling the cabin with sound. They laughed and played in the yard, their small feet kicking up the earth, their faces bright with joy. Silas watched them, his heart swelling with something he hadn't known he could feel. He was alive again, not just surviving, but truly living. He had a family, a real family. One evening after dinner, Marabel joined Silas on the porch. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, casting the world in gold. She handed him a mug of tea and sat beside him, her body close to his. They didn't speak at first, but there was comfort in the silence, a deep, abiding connection that neither had expected but both had come to cherish. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world seemed at peace. The cabin, once just a place of survival, was now a home, a place full of warmth, love, and the promise of a future they would build together. And in that moment, Silas and Marabel both knew that despite everything they had gone through, they had found something worth fighting for. And it was here, in this small, quiet place, that they would stay, together. The days grew warmer, and with each passing week, the snow melted more, leaving behind patches of earth that seemed to breathe again, returning to life. The cabin, once a humble shelter for survival, was now a place that felt like a home. Marabel and Silas worked side by side, their routines smooth and practiced. The sounds of the cabin, the crackling of the fire, the soft murmur of conversation, the laughter of their children, became the soundtrack of their new life, a life they had carved out of the wilderness, brick by brick, moment by moment. Silas had begun to teach Marabel the skills he had learned over the years: how to mend fences, how to properly set traps for food, how to care for the land. She had taken to it quickly, her hands no longer trembling, her confidence growing with every task she took on. They shared everything: the good days, the hard ones, and the quiet moments in between. When Silas went hunting, Marabel would stay behind with the children, tending to the fire and preparing the meals, always looking out the window, watching for his return. One afternoon, after Silas returned from a hunting trip with a wild turkey in tow, Marabel was busy in the kitchen, the smell of stew simmering in the pot. The children were playing outside, their laughter drifting through the open door. Marabel smiled as she listened to their voices, feeling something warm and deep settle in her chest. It was the sound of normalcy, of family, of a life that was hers, something she had never thought possible. As Silas entered the cabin, wiping the sweat from his brow, he saw her standing at the stove, her back to him. Her hair had grown longer, and she had begun to wear it loosely tied back, strands falling softly around her face. The sight of her, so focused and content, made his heart swell with a quiet pride. "You've made it," he said softly, his voice rough from the cold outside. Marabel turned to face him, her smile as warm as the fire crackling beside them. "Only because we're doing it together." He nodded, walking over to her, and together they shared a quiet moment, the weight of the world outside seeming far away. The struggles they had faced, the darkness they had come from, all felt like distant memories now. They had built something from the ashes of their past, something real. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like they had found peace. As the seasons changed, so did the rhythm of their lives. The babies grew more independent, their tiny voices filling the air with joy and mischief. Eloise ran ahead, her little feet quick and sure. Ruth followed with a curious gaze, while June would sing as she wandered, her voice soft and melodic. The land around the cabin flourished with them. Silas and Marabel would often sit together on the porch after a long day, watching the children play, the world quieting down as the sun dipped low behind the mountains. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the yard, Marabel stood by the garden, her hands resting on her hips as she looked out across the land. It had taken time, but she had come to love the earth beneath her feet, the land that had once seemed so cold and hostile. She had learned to find beauty in its harshness, to appreciate the small moments, like the way the wind stirred the tall grass or the way the evening light danced across the mountains. Silas stood beside her, watching the horizon, his arm casually draped over her shoulders. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the past behind them, the future stretching out before them like an open field. "I never thought I could be happy like this," Marabel said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas turned to her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that spoke volumes. "I never thought I could either," he admitted. "But we've found something, haven't we?" She nodded slowly, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, we have. We've found each other." The silence that followed was comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. They didn't need to say anything more. They had built something together, a home, a family, a future. And in that quiet, peaceful moment, they knew that no matter what the world might throw at them, they had already won. As the summer stretched on, Marabel found herself embracing not just the life she had created, but also the person she had become. She was no longer the frightened, broken woman who had been abandoned in the snow. She was a mother, a partner, and a woman who had discovered her own strength. And in Silas, she had found someone who understood her in a way no one else had ever done. They had become something more than just survivors. They had become a family. One afternoon, after a long day of work, they sat together on the porch, watching their daughters chase each other around the yard, their laughter echoing in the still air. Silas and Marabel sat side by side, their fingers entwined, content to just be in each other's presence. The world around them was full of challenges and unknowns, but in that moment they had everything they needed. The future, uncertain as it was, no longer seemed so daunting, because together they knew they could face anything. And in the warmth of the firelight, with their daughters asleep in the next room, Marabel leaned her head on Silas's shoulder, and for the first time in years, she felt truly at home. As the summer faded into autumn, the days grew shorter, and the crisp air of fall settled over the mountains. The colors of the leaves turned from green to brilliant hues of red, orange, and gold, casting a warm glow over the cabin and its surroundings. The air was filled with the earthy scent of the forest, the last breath of summer before winter claimed the land once again. The cabin, though small, had become a haven. The walls, now reinforced with Silas's hard work, stood sturdy against the changing seasons. The roof had been patched, the windows sealed tight against the coming cold. Inside, the fire crackled merrily, providing warmth and light to the family that had come together in this remote place. Marabel had spent the last few months expanding the garden, planting more vegetables and herbs, while Silas had been busy with preparations for winter. The two of them worked in harmony, their tasks overlapping as they shared the work of maintaining their home. The land, though still harsh at times, had begun to offer its rewards. The babies were no longer the fragile infants they had once been. Eloise, Ruth, and June had grown into lively, curious toddlers, their energy filling the cabin with an infectious joy. They would follow Marabel around as she worked, their small hands reaching for anything they could touch, their laughter echoing through the rooms. It was the sound of life, of hope, and of a future being built right before their eyes. One evening, after the girls had gone to sleep, Silas and Marabel sat on the porch together, wrapped in warm blankets. The stars above twinkled brightly, the night sky clear and vast. The only sound was the crackling of the fire they had built outside, a small fire that danced in the cool air. They had learned to appreciate these quiet moments, these stolen seconds where the world seemed to slow down, just enough for them to breathe. "I've been thinking," Marabel said, her voice soft and thoughtful. Silas turned his head to look at her, his expression gentle, patient. He had become accustomed to the silences between them, the quiet moments where words were unnecessary. But when she did speak, he listened with a quiet intensity as though every word mattered. "About what?" he asked, his voice low. "About the future," she said, her eyes distant as she looked out at the mountains. "About the girls, about what kind of life I want them to have." Silas didn't respond right away. He simply sat there beside her, his arm resting along the back of the chair. The flickering firelight illuminated his face, casting shadows that made his features appear even more rugged, more weathered. But there was something in his eyes, a softness, a depth, that told Marabel all she needed to know. "You're already giving them the best life you can," he said finally. "A life full of love and safety and peace. They'll grow up knowing they're wanted, knowing they matter." Marabel's lips curled into a faint smile, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I hope so. I want them to know that the world isn't all bad, that there's beauty in it, even in the hard parts. I want them to know love, Silas, to grow up knowing they're loved. Silas reached over and took her hand in his rough fingers brushing against her skin. The connection between them was as natural as the seasons changing, unspoken, unbroken. He didn't need to say anything more. She already knew the truth in his touch, in the way he held her hand. "Then they'll know," he said, his voice steady. "Because of you." They sat in silence for a while longer, the cool breeze stirring the leaves around them. The world outside was quiet, and for a moment it felt as though everything had stopped. It was just them, the fire, the stars, and the unspoken understanding that had bound them together. The following weeks brought with them the first bite of winter. The temperature dropped, and the snow began to fall again, blanketing the mountains in a familiar, silent cover. Silas and Marabel spent their days preparing for the season ahead, stacking firewood, storing supplies, and ensuring the cabin was ready for the long, cold months. One particularly bitter morning, after a heavy snowstorm had swept through the area, Silas returned from the woods, his face red from the cold, his breath visible in the frosty air. He had been gone all morning, and Marabel had been busy inside, taking care of the girls and making sure the fire stayed warm. As he entered the cabin, he saw Marabel sitting by the hearth, a basket of laundry beside her. Her hair had begun to grow longer, and though she was still thin from the hardships of her past, there was a strength in her now, a quiet power that made her more beautiful than ever. He smiled, a rare, soft smile that reached his eyes. "It's getting cold out there," he said, his voice low. "We're going to need more firewood before the night comes." Marabel nodded, glancing at him from across the room. "I'll bundle up the girls and we'll bring in more." Her voice was steady, though there was a hint of weariness in her tone. Life hadn't gotten easier, but it had become something she could handle. It had become a rhythm, a dance of sorts, one she had learned to move with no matter the challenges. Silas moved toward her, his boots crunching on the snow-covered floor. He knelt beside her, taking a deep breath of the warm air in the cabin. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter now, "for everything." Marabel looked at him, her eyes soft, her heart full. "I don't think you need to thank me," she replied. "I'm just living, just doing what needs to be done." Silas's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, then he stood and walked over to the girls, who were now stirring in their cradles. He lifted Alois into his arms, his heart swelling with love for this tiny person who had come into his life when he least expected it. The warmth of her tiny body against his chest was everything he needed, everything he had ever wanted. Marabel joined him, and the two of them stood together, watching their daughters, their small hands reaching for them, their eyes bright with innocence. They had built a life here, a family, a home, and it was enough. It was more than enough. And as the winter winds howled outside, they held each other close, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Winter had come fully to the mountains, painting everything in shades of white and gray. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin there was warmth, warmth from the fire, warmth from the family they had built, and warmth that ran deeper than the flames themselves. Silas, Marabel, and their 3 daughters had created something powerful and lasting, something stronger than any storm the world could throw at them. The days grew short, and the nights grew long, but they no longer feared the dark. They had learned to survive the harshness of life, not just with grit, but with love and trust that filled the cabin in ways the cold could never reach. The world outside may have been unforgiving, but inside they had each other. And that was all that mattered. One evening, as the fire flickered low in the hearth, Silas stood by the window, his gaze lost in the heavy snow falling outside. The wind howled, but it sounded distant now, muted by the warmth inside. Marabel sat by the fire, her back resting against the chair, her hands busy knitting a scarf for the girls. The air was filled with the soft sound of the knitting needles clicking together, the crackling of the fire, and the soft breathing of their daughters as they slept nearby, curled together in a cozy pile. Silas turned and walked over to her, a quiet smile on his face. He had never been one for many words, but the life they had built together spoke for itself. His hand gently rested on Marabel's shoulder as he leaned in, his voice low. "How did we get here?" he asked, his voice a little rough from the quiet of the evening. Marabel looked up at him, her smile soft and tender. "We got here together," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured. "We made this happen, Silas. We survived, and we made a family, we made a home." Her words hung in the air, settling between them like the warmth of the fire. Silas sat down beside her, his hand finding hers, fingers intertwining. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. They both understood. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside they had found their peace. The world beyond the cabin was still wild and uncertain, but in here there was only the promise of safety, of love, and of the life they had chosen to build. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was theirs. It was more than they had ever dreamed of when they first met, and more than either of them had thought possible in the harsh wilderness of the American frontier. Marabel looked over at their 3 daughters, still sleeping soundly, their small breaths rising and falling in rhythm. They had built something precious together. And now, in this moment, as they sat in the warmth of the firelight, Silas and Marabel knew they had created something that could never be taken away. Something that would last forever, not because it was without hardship, but because it was built on trust, sacrifice, and a love that had survived the worst storms. And in that silence, surrounded by the warmth of their home, their hearts full of gratitude and love, they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The storm outside would eventually pass, just like all the others. And when it did, the cabin on Granger Ridge would still be standing, a testament to the strength of the love that had built it. The wind outside howled one last time, but inside, Silas and Marabel smiled at each other, their hearts beating in quiet unison. They were not alone anymore. They had each other, and that was enough, for now and always.